I'm going to try to be brief, but I have to share the story. So I'm Maureen McGuigan. I'm the Deputy Director of Arts and Culture for Lackawanna County. I know some of you, but I don't know a lot of people, which always makes me happy because that means our programming is getting people out. So we run a lot of different programs. Our winter market is coming up. We hope you come out for that for December 6th, 7th, and 8th. And we have a snowman theme. Thanks to Bob, because last year I learned about his book and literally fell in love with it. I found it at WVIA, ordered a copy, I stalked him on Facebook, sent him a message, and he was so gracious to respond. And a year later, we invited him to kick off our winter holiday activities. So that is why we are here. And he has such an extensive background, New Yorker cartoonist, award-winning illustrator, has been in publications like the Wall Street Journal, and I'm sure he's going to talk about this New York Times. So I don't want to talk too much. I'm going to hand it over to Bob. Thank you for braving the winter mix, which is kind of appropriate. So just enjoy. We have plenty of food after and a cash bar. Non-alcoholic drinks are free and book signing after. So welcome.
Well, thank you very much, Maureen. Thank you for having me here. This is great to be here. I'm going to start off first by asking if anyone started doing their Christmas decorations. No? Because this is just something I want to get off my chest right now. Out here, it's a lot different setting up. I just wanted to share something that's a lot different in New York City where I live in the apartments. My apartment is the left-hand side. And this is the sort of thing that's very commonplace, these sort of competitions for decorations. Anyway, I wanted to mention this story because this went viral. If you type in Reef Wars or Country in Divide, you will see the story that I had, this quarrel I had with my neighbor. What I did was I tried to up the ante, and you could see I went big there, and that began the war. They didn't seem to be puzzled by it. They didn't seem to be upset, so I had to take it up another level. I hired outside contractors to start to build a reef that I thought would just put them to shame. So this is it. It spins, it sings, it has pyrotechnics, but still, it didn't really upset them too much. It was a dark day that I went that far, so I decided to go the other way and do the George Costanza, do the opposite, and then went this way, really tiny. And then I decided I'm going to really need some outside help, so I started a Kickstarter to fund what I wanted to build was a reef that you could see from Earth. As you can see here, you could donate $20 toward my project. It'll take a couple of years to complete and to humiliate my neighbors. I'm only kidding. There is no Kickstarter. I'm making that part up. The fact that my neighbors hate me, that part's real. Anyway, what I'm going to do is I'm going to first talk about myself just a little bit and tell you my background and how I got to be a snowman expert. And I'll explain first that this is one of my books. Actually, I couldn't find a book on my iPhone, so I just put this up. This is a cake of my book. Footnotes from the world's greatest bookstores is in a few languages. It's a Times bestseller, and there's a TV show being made about it. I teach at NYU. I'm an editor at Writer's Digest, and I draw live events like the Super Bowl and the Oscars. And I worked for Mad Magazine and National Lampoon and Spy. This is one of my books as well. I edited this collection of cartoons. This book came about because I wanted to thank you to all the bookstores that helped make my other books such a success. And this is the follow-up that just came out a few days ago. This is perfect with Thanksgiving coming up, when everyone likes to complain and everything. Often I'm asked at readings, what was the first book or my favorite book? So I'm putting this up there. This is my very first book. Read it when I was around 4. And this is the Snowman book. We'll talk a little bit about Snowman in a moment after I talk about my beginnings. Sarge, permission to move freely. When I was really small, I began training to draw and paint by taking plastic army men and painting hockey uniforms on these plastic army men. And it was sort of like my first military or political statements that I was painting these military army men. And this was when I was like around 4 or 5. I grew up in the South Bronx. English is not my first language. I don't have a first language. I grew up in the projects. And I was an altar boy. I love Christmas. And so I do a lot of religious cartoons. I worked for America, which is the largest Catholic magazine in the world, and I did all their cartoons. I eventually went to art school at Pratt Institute in Brooklyn, and instrumental to going there, I had sort of an enemy in school. As we all do, we always have a nemesis when we go to college, someone who kind of, always butts heads with us. And I was no different, and I had someone who my whole time at college, we kept on having, sort of a conflict. But this person went on later to become very important to my life, and I'll explain in a moment how. Actually, everything in my life has been by accident. Oops, I'm going to go back. First of all, there was a bee in the car. This is based on real life, and everything that has happened to me, how I became a cartoonist and a snowman expert was all quite by accident. When I went to Pratt Institute, it was after I kind of dropped out of high school. I didn't go my senior year. I was sneaking in college. I would go in and just sit in classes. And then when it was time to try to apply for college, I would use letter of recommendations from the teachers that I had, telling them that I've already been in their class. So I kind of... this is one of my favorite cartoons. Jim, just put that hole behind you. It's one of my favorite because the story behind this is, it's the only time I had a job. I worked at a golf course when I was a teenager. And my first day at work, I was sending people off to tee off at the first tee. And I was joking with the people playing golf and who were ready to go off on their golf carts. And the owner of the club came racing down in a golf cart, and he fired me in front of everyone. He said, "We don't allow people who are on drugs to be here." I was not on drugs. I was just making people laugh. And he fired me right there after like two hours of working on the job. And I made up my mind then that I would never have a real job. And I've kept that pledge, and that's why this cartoon is so important to me. Anyway, later, Darth Vader, later, 12 years later, I ran into my enemy from college. Actually, it wasn't at a class reunion. It was at a funeral. Ed was claustrophobic. And it was here that I met my enemy. And this time around, we got along a little bit better. And we decided that, this might as well happen. We went off to here, the capital of Iceland, and we eloped. And I married my enemy. How long has your husband been missing? You can see the husband's up in the hat. It was because of my wife that I decided to get into more things. She pushed me into other things, and she had me explore some of my obsessions with things like snow. And at this time, I was writing for a lot of magazines. I was a columnist for The Village Voice and Time Out magazine, and I was writing for the New York Times. And I was approached by a lot of agents and publishers asking me if I was interested in writing a book. And I've always had an interest in Sherlock Holmes, and I always loved mystery. But I knew I didn't want to do a negative mystery. I wanted to do something positive. So I was thinking, like, who told the first joke? Or who made the first sandwich? And I decided who made the first snowman would be my quest. That was the best thing to do because I had gone into bookstores and I learned that there was no books for the holidays that were non-denominational. So anyway, I set my sights on this holy grail of finding who made the first snowman. It was a 7-year project. I traveled around the world. and I collected a dream team of experts. I got together professors in cultural history, art historians. This is the Snowman Festival in Japan. This is actually the Sahara Desert. They got some snow, they built a snowman. This is Moscow. This is the Swiss Alps, and this is that famous hotel you see in the James Bond movies. That's a Circle Hotel. My friend actually owns that hotel, and he made the snowman. This is Bamberg Castle in England. I actually hired scholars to translate the diaries from the Middle Ages for me to see if they could find any reference of making a snowman from the darker Middle Ages. This is Ireland's highest mountain. This is in Bethel, Maine. World's tallest snowman. It's 13 stories high. It required work permits and cranes and teamsters. And this is a global warming protest in Berlin. And this is in China. So after 7 years of being a snowman expert, I realized that snowman making was actually an art. It's actually a modern art that contemporaries are using as a theme. Here's another example. This is by David Humphrey, who actually lives up by Wayne County, and he's a well-known artist. This is actually a coffin. Somebody wanted to be buried in a snowman. So I started looking for who made the first snowman. I really didn't know where to begin. I started looking for clues at the obvious places, flea markets and yard sales, and just started collecting stuff. And this is a portion of my world's largest collection of snowmen, which is over 800 items. But I learned quickly that it had nothing to do with the snowman's history, that the snowman's history is actually way darker and goes way back. Although we all know it, oops. Oh, here we go. We all know it as Frosty the Snowman, which is unfortunate because it's just a kid's thing. This is actually from 1954, and it was a 4-minute movie that was always played around Christmas time.
With a corncob pipe
and a button nose
and 2 eyes made out of coal. Frosty the Snowman is a fairy tale, they say.
It was actually based on a children's book, which in the end was stolen from another children's book. So,
there must have been some magic in that.
okay, I'm going to skip ahead though. And we all know the modern Frosty the Snowman. And this is actually the guy who drew Frosty the Snowman sent me this drawing. I got to know him when I wanted him to be interviewed for the book. What I did was I purchased a portrait he did in college on eBay and then notified him that I had his self-portrait from college, and that's how we became friends. Well, the snowman does have this history in the 1920s I call the Dean Martin years, where he was drinking a lot, and he actually looked a lot like W.C. Fields. And I was trying to figure out which came first, the W.C. Fields steal from the snowman or vice versa. But you can see here, this is not a great time. He's a menacing snowman. He's chasing a girl with a pointed stick. He's got booze in his hand, and there's some violence. Santa's trying to kill him. Kid trying to kill the snowman. Anyway, I learned all of this had nothing to do really with the snowman's history. I quickly found out that there was the miracle of 1511 and the massacre of 1690 and these amazing history benchmarks in which the snowman was sort of like a frozen Forrest Gump right there at the moment of these crazy things. One example of a more important thing is that the snowman is part of a holiday called Six Bells Ringing. It's a national holiday in Switzerland. And what they do is they parade this very flammable snowman through the town first in a parade, and then they put him in the town square where they plan to blow him up. He's stuffed with highly flammable kindling and dynamite. And depending on how fast he blows up is a signal of how early spring is going to come. If you look carefully, the snowman's in the back there. and this is an army of Germans. They love posing with snowmen. The Snowman was actually part of this film from 1940, which was created by some of the people who would later work with Walt Disney. But it was actually a Nazi propaganda movie. And the people working on it, though, were anti-Nazi, and they made this film with these secret messages which were actually considered anti-Nazi. I've seen this movie a few times, and I don't see the messages. To me, it's just the snowman in the winter. But it is groundbreaking. It's one of the most advanced animations for its time of 1940. So every time there was an advancement in science or technology or entertainment, even in pornography or a political commentary, the snowman was right there in the forefront. Here's one example. This is a silent movie from 1908. If you got up to get popcorn, you missed the whole thing because it lasts only about a minute. But the very first silent movies included snowmen. And this film I actually saw in the archive over in Hamlin, which is like the largest collection in the world, second to only the Getty collection in California. And this collects all the film archives from all the famous directors like Martin Scorsese and Spielberg. They all leave their personal collection in these vaults. And there I find the earliest movies and the Snowman. The Snowman also appeared in the very first postcards and stamps. Actually, some of these are trading cards. And back then of the Victorian times, around 1890, instead of just having a business card, people would have these beautifully colorful illustrated business cards left on the counter for people to take and collect. This is from the French Revolution. It's one of the most important snowmen. There was this French troupe that during its break began a snowball fight. Actually, snowball fights actually take a real place in history. I don't know if many people know that the Boston Tea Party, for instance, it all began with a snowball fight, and it just escalated. In this case, this snowball fight escalated in these artists who were all put together in this one troupe to make a beautiful snowman, actually a snow woman. And this became famous, and it was engraved, and it was written about in newspapers. There was poetry about it, and it became a rally cry for the revolution of 1870 in Paris. This is from 1840, and it's one of the earliest photographs ever. This was by Mary Dillon from Wales, and she was making a set of a dozen photographs for her sick niece. And Mary was a pioneer in photography. Her whole family was on the forefront of the first photography. And since this came out a few years ago, there have been some photographs that are date earlier that are not simply silver plates of silhouettes, but actually also photographs. So I'm not sure if this is exactly one of the very earliest, but Mary did do one of the earliest candid shots. She was a person who tried to capture people smiling, or a chicken running across the road, or even a couple making a snowman. And back then, because of the exposure and stuff, these are things that didn't really happen too often with the very first photographs. For instance, people holding a smile was very rare because it was sort of actually taboo, also because people had poor teeth, and also because you had to keep still for so long to capture the exposure. This is actually an illustration I did because no documentation exists for the story of the snow angel of 1859. And this snow angel was made by one of America's most important sculptors, Larkin Mead. Larkin Mead made the snow angel when he was 19 on New Year's Eve, with the town waking up to this beautiful sculpture, which is a recording angel, recording who passed away the year earlier. When the town woke up to this, they couldn't believe the masterpiece, and people from all around in other lands came to see, traveling 4 to 5 hours to see this sculpture. Larkin Mead would later go on to do the Lincoln Memorial in Springfield. But it's an example that as you go past Frosty the Snowman, it was more of an art, and famous artists actually constructed and crafted snowmen. Even Michelangelo made a snowman when he was a teenager at 19, where he was commissioned to do one in a palace yard. This is actually now the massacre of 1690, which took place at Fort Schenectady. And here we had 2 guards who were supposed to guard the gates, but they were frozen shut open from a blizzard. And they went inside the pub to, I'll go backwards for 1 minute. Oops. They went inside the pub to drink instead of watching their guard, and instead all these French Indians and French soldiers came down from Montreal to Fort Schenectady, and they massacred the village. And this happened in 1690. It's actually one of the bloodiest events in early American history. So this is an example of the miracle of 1511. In 1511, there was this big, enormous snowstorm, and everyone went out to make these amazing snow creations. But it was also an early form of political commentary, as people made these scenes in which spoke about the church or the government. In this case, that's the Pope. And there was always a lot of conflict with the church and the government. And so this was a way for people to express their unhappiness in a time in which there was no newspapers, there was no books even, because only the rich had glasses. And with a snowstorm, people had free art supplies dumped right at their front doorstep, giving them the chance to do that. As a matter of fact, it was sort of like a Woodstock of the Middle Ages, because they also created like hundreds of pornographic scenes as well. I'm not going to show them now, but here's an example of the level of artwork that they would do. They would also do things like folklore and Greek mythology. And this is a woodcut that I made just as an example of the sort of celebration they would have at this time at these, they called them winter festivals. And it was a chance to blow off steam at a time in which they didn't quite understand these high concepts like the church and sex and death. So they expressed themselves with snowmen. When I was doing my research, I went everywhere looking for evidence of a snowman. So I was looking for large snowballs, because where there's smoke, there's fire. And I'm going to show this piece here, which is very interesting. This is a fresco from a castle in Italy, dated 1408. And it's a fresco that shows the very first depiction of a snowball fight. The woman over here on the right, that's actually not peeling fresco, but that's her getting pelted in the face with a snowball. So my search led me to this piece here, which is very important, which I found at the Royal Library at The Hague. And the Royal Library houses the largest collection of images in the world at 8 million. I spent a few days there with a magnifying glass looking for any blob of snow, and I came across this illuminated manuscript, and you'll see there's an image of a snowman in the margins, alongside that solemn passage of the crucifixion of Christ. And this image is actually anti-Semitic. We know that because my team of experts and I see that this is a hat used to symbolize Jews in Gothic art. This is how we know some of the messages, some of the hidden messages in Gothic art. And this is an example of it. And it's an example of very vulgar humor used at this time, again, trying to understand this sort of mysterious concepts of death and God. And they would do it in these really bizarre forms of humor. And in this case, with the melting snowman over that pot, and a Jewish snowman, it's sort of a spectacular way to insult two religions at the same time. Anyway, I do go into whether or not prehistoric man made snowmen in my book. I had the leading archaeologists theorize and contemplate the chances that prehistoric man did make snowmen back then. And we're all convinced that he did, because man would make images of himself in any material found, whether it's wood or mud or even snow. The reason why we all think that cave paintings was the main form of art for prehistoric man is only because cave art is the most preserved. It's so deep in the cave that it's the only thing that survived. But that's just the very tip of the iceberg. What we learned is that man was very fluent as an artist and had this real dimension of being playful, which is all about snowmen. I mean, we tried to discover whether snowmen were made for other reasons, religious reasons, or for hunting reasons, but for just playfulness seems to be the reason, in the same way that man now, scientists, are discovering that the cave paintings of handprints were done just for playfulness. They know this because of the different sizes of the handprints, showing that children did it as well as adults. So I'm going to go into briefly how I got into cartoons as well, because it had to do with the snowman. And the chain of events was that when I was doing the Snowman book, I thought it was very thick with a lot of academic stuff and a lot of stories that can be a little bit long, and I wanted an intermission. So I decided I was going to have a collection of the world's greatest snowman cartoons in the middle, and I went to the New Yorker to purchase them. The book cost me about $22,000 in photo rights and all expenses, and I actually ran out of money by the time I was adding the cartoons. An example was that fresco. To reprint that fresco in my book was, I think, $2,500. So each of these things added up. And so I decided I was going to fill the empty space with my own cartoons. I had never really done gag cartoons, but I figured I'd do that. And what happened after that was the New Yorker, as a thank you, took me out to lunch because I had spent all this money purchasing other cartoons from them. The first 3D Thanksgiving. If you have 3D glasses with you, put them on now, because you'll see this turkey coming right at you. At this lunch that I had at the New Yorker, I got a chance to meet a lot of people who I grew up really admiring, like Sam Gross and Gaham Wilson and Leo Cullum. And I had a really good time, and I asked if I could come back. And Sam Gross said, sure, you could come back. But come back with 10 sketches, and we'll see if you could do a cartoon for us at the New Yorker. I couldn't come back the week after that because I couldn't come up with 10 ideas. I found it too difficult, but I did come back in 2 weeks, and I was introduced to Bob Mankoff, who was in charge of the cartoons. And he actually purchased the very first cartoon that I did, which was a very rare occurrence. Although I didn't know at the time that it was actually beginner's luck, because it would be another year before I sold another cartoon. I do a lot of cartoons, again, based on real life, and I haven't had much luck with contractors showing up, and I have many, many contractor cartoons. I actually had a time in which I would add my doctor or mechanic in the cartoon so I could trade with them a cartoon. In this case, I believe this paid for an MRI. And that is my doctor in the corner. When I go to his office, he has cartoons all over his office of himself. I had a lot of free time this year. There goes that new car smell. This cartoon actually went viral. It was in all over Brazil and China and all these other places were stealing it at these yoga meditation centers. It had 750,000 likes on Facebook. At the New Yorker, I started to expand, and I started doing some writing assignments. And one assignment was about bookstores. And it kind of combined all these elements that I really enjoy doing this book. This book was about bookstores, and I was going to include all these celebrities whose life was changed in bookstores. And in the book, I include people like Tom Wolfe, Paul McCartney, David Bowie's in it, Robin Williams, and all sorts of people from all walks of life explaining how much bookstores meant to them. And the book was really a lot of fun because I love painting, I love bookstores, and I love name dropping. So I'm just going to mention I also started that project by making a list of my favorite people, and it included Michael Palin from Monty Python, someone who inspired me to go into humor, and then I later became friends with him, so it was fun to have that. Garrison Keillor is in the book, and I have all these stories. I'm saying these descriptions, and at the same time, in my head, I'm getting bombarded with all these different stories to say. So I'll share one quick story. Someone I know, does anyone here know Terry Gross? Okay, well, I'll share my Terry Gross story. Terry Gross and I were chatting. At first, we didn't really know each other, but we were texting each other online and stuff, and she was a fan of my cartoons, and I was a fan of her show. And we actually were even texting each other at the last election, talking about the results and commenting and stuff like that. So then we started getting a little closer, and we started writing more, and I decided I was going to thank her for being a friend. I wrote her saying that, Terry, I really appreciate, taking the time to talk to me because I know how busy you are. But autocorrect has always been trying to destroy my career, and it came out instead, Terry, I know how busty you are. Well, thankfully, she's a very good sport about it, and we're good friends now. So anyway, this is just one more example from the bookstore. I think this is the end, and I'd like to know if you want to do a little Q&A. Oops, I'm going to go backwards for a minute. This is to get you into the Christmas spirit. Where do you see yourself in 5 months? Yes, so let me open the floor to any questions. Does anyone have a question? A famous cartoonist. Yeah, but not a cartoon. You're asking cartoonist, right? It would have to be Sam Gross, who I spend a lot of time with now. We work on our cartoons together. And I consider him the greatest living cartoonist. He's in his late 80s at the moment. And he's on the cover of my cartoon book. I made sure he would be on the cover. And I think he's really changed cartooning, and I just love his work. He's the guy who did the famous cartoon with the frog coming out of the back kitchen of a restaurant with no legs. He's in a, yeah. But thanks. While you're thinking of another question, I'm just going to remind you, I want to thank everyone for coming out in this really bad weather. So I was just saying that I'm giving like a $5 discount for any book, and yeah, is my way of saying thanks for making it. Also, you can hang out, and if you think of a question, I'll be around. You could talk to me. I'm going to hang out for a moment. Mary Ann.
How long did it take you to get all these things together on the Snowman, and how many countries did you end up visiting?
Well, it took 7 years initially, where I did all the documentation, and then I came out with a newer edition last year, which updates everything and things change. The book couldn't have been done without the internet, because I was contacting all corners of the world, people who are experts of different, things that I needed expertise on. As I mentioned, I hired translators, and I went to all these different museums and libraries. And country-wise, I would say I went to about 10 different countries, maybe a dozen. In some cases, I had to send somebody else, just for logistics and because of time. And there was no reason for me to go initially, because unless they found the lead for me to go over there and find out. This kind of started with my marriage to my wife. When we went to Iceland, that's where I kind of thought also of snowmen. I was thinking, here I am. We were trying to go to the most northern point to get married, because I am obsessed with snow. When I was a little kid, what I would ask for Christmas was like weather journals and books about Antarctica. And right now I have hundreds of books about Antarctica. And my next book is about travels through the North Pole. It's about the missing Sir John Franklin, and it's a diary from 1850. But going back, I went to Iceland, and I learned, there was some talk about this and that, but I also learned that the further north that you went, there was no snowman made because there was a lack of moisture. And to make a good snowman, you do need moisture. So to my surprise, I found out that a lot of the historical events took place in France and Italy. And that's where all the winter festivals took place, as well as in Brussels, Belgium. That was another hotbed for snowmen. But it took me about 7 years initially, and then I spent another 10 years on and off updating the new book, because things changed. The world's records for the tallest snowman changed. People came to me with new evidence that changed in the last 10 years, and I had this amazing amount of photographs for the second book. And like I said, the first book, I ran out of money. And I did spend as much as I could, and there's like a nice, beautiful color section in the middle. But the new book, I was able to make it no expenses spared, and now the book is full color, glossy, and it's as beautiful as it could be. And at least I know that I could say I did the best job I could possibly do with this book. I didn't leave anything on the table. I did everything I could to make it exactly the way it should be. Okay, one last question? No? Well, again, thanks, and thanks, Maureen.
So awesome. Bob is such a talented, accomplished artist, but just a really nice guy to work with. I'm an administrator, so I appreciate those things. Well, thank you for coming out. Just want to make one more plug for our winter market, December 6th, 7th, and 8th on a Wyoming Avenue in front of the historic Globe Store. Again, inspired by the Snowman book, we also have a Snow People, be politically correct, trail. We have these things you can take selfies in. They'll be at all downtown businesses as a way to encourage people to enjoy the beautiful downtown Scranton. So they'll be up for the whole season. But for now, there's books for sale. And then if you go to the left and just walk a little bit, there's a beautiful Raymond Hood room named after the architect who designed this building, who also designed Rockefeller Center. So we have some snacks and a bar. So you're welcome to hang out and just discuss this awesome lecture. So thank you. Enjoy. And we have a Scranton gift for you. Some Electric City treats. So thank you again.